It's November 10th, 1975, exactly 62 years after the Great Lakes storm of 1913. Captain Bernie Cooper of the lake freighter Arthur M. Anderson found his vessel sailing through a massive gale on Lake Superior. Since the previous day, she'd been following another vessel, the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald. Cooper had been monitoring the Fitzgerald on his radar screen. However, as the storm continued to intensify, Fitzgerald simply disappeared from the Anderson's radar. This only meant that the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the largest vessels on the Great Lakes, had simply vanished with no distress call or mayday. Not a single one of the Fitzgerald's 29 crew members ever turned up. She became the largest ship ever lost on the Great Lakes. Although her wreck was found in the weeks following the incident, her loss remains a mystery to this day. For decades, shipwrecks on the Great Lakes have been a way of life. But as technology progressed, shipwrecks were still thought of as tragedies of the past, since the largest freighters were between 600 to 700 feet long. However, there still were shipwrecks in the 1950s and the 60s, such as of the loss of the freighter Carl D. Bradley in 1958, and the loss of the freighter Daniel J. Morrell in 1966. But one of them reigned superior as the largest vessel lost on the Great Lakes. She was named Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald story begins in the late 1950s, when the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, based in Milwaukee, invested in the iron ore industries as well as other materials in the region on a massive scale. It called for the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald. In February of 1957, the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard of River Rouge, Michigan, was contracted to build the Fitzgerald. When she would soon be completed, the Edmund Fitzgerald would be the largest vessel on the Great Lakes, earning her the unofficial title Queen of the Lakes. Then, on June 7, 1958, exactly 10 months after construction began, the ship was ready for launch. The ship would be named Edmund Fitzgerald after the president of Northwestern Life Insurance. Unfortunately, when Elizabeth Fitzgerald, the wife of Edmund Fitzgerald, tried to christen the ship by smashing a bottle of champagne against her hull, it took her 3 attempts just to get the bottle to break. And then a 36-minute delay occurred when the crew tried to release the support struts to let the ship go down the slipway. Then, as the ship was sent down the slipway and into the water, the ship generated a huge wave that crashed over the pier, and considering that the Fitzgerald was barely able to fit in the basin, some of the spectators reported that the ship was trying to climb out of the water. A Toledo man in the crowd was so shaken by the impact that he suffered a heart attack and dies on the scene. Nonetheless, the Fitzgerald's launch was captured on video, showing how the ship did indeed try to climb over the dock. Later that month, the Fitzgerald's fitting out process was completed, and she was ready to be put into service. She measured 728 feet in length, had a beam of 75 feet, and came in at 13,632 gross registered tons. She was designed to be the biggest vessel on the Great Lakes, but she was designed to also be within a foot of the maximum size required to fit through the locks on the St. Lawrence Seaway, allowing her to reach the Atlantic Ocean. She was powered by a single coal-fired Westinghouse steam turbine engine that produced 7,500 shaft horsepower, driving a single 4-blade propeller, and achieved a top speed of 14 knots. Despite the misfortune on the ship's launch, the Fitzgerald would go on to have a successful career, with a few exceptions. In 1970, the ship collided with the freighter Hochelaga. Luckily, both ships survived the collision. Later that year, while she was traveling through the Sioux, she struck one of the sides of the lock. And in 1973 and 74, she lost her anchor in the Detroit River. Aside from those mishaps, Fitzgerald had a very successful career, carrying tens of thousands of tons of iron ore to ports such as Detroit, Toledo, and many more. Between 1971 and 1972, the Fitz had undergone a refit, where her original coal-fired boilers were converted to oil burning instead. Over the course of her 17-year career, the Edmund Fitzgerald had completed more than 748 round-trip voyages covering more than 1 million miles, until 1975 when her successful career came to a shocking end. It's November 9th, 1975. The Fitzgerald is at the docks in Duluth Superior. preparing to take on her cargo of 26,000 tons of iron ore. While loading, she took on 50,000 gallons of fuel for the 750-mile journey ahead of her. At the time, the Fitzgerald was under the command of Captain Ernest M. McSorley, a Great Lakes veteran with over 45 years of experience, as well as First Mate Jack McCarthy, who supervised the loading and unloading process of the cargo the Fitzgerald would take on. It's also important to mention that when the cargo was being loaded, the crew used this indicator light to tell the ship is level. If the light is in the middle, that means the ship is sitting level in the water, whereas if the light is leaning to the left or right, that means the ship is listing to starboard or port. And to secure the cargo holds, these huge steel plates were placed over Fitzgerald's holds to make a watertight seal, because if water started to flow into these holds, it could be disastrous for the freighter. And they were secured by these huge steel clamps to make sure the plate would not move while the ship was under stress or pitching or rolling. Finally, after about 6 hours of taking on her cargo, the Fitzgerald pulled away from the dock for the last time, through the Duluth Ship Canal and out into Lake Superior. She was destined for the steel mill on Zug Island just outside of Detroit, a 750-mile, 2-day voyage. Shortly after departing Superior, another large vessel joined the Fitzgerald, the Arthur M. Anderson. She was built in the early 1950s by the American Shipbuilding Company of Lorain, Ohio, as one of the AAA class freighters, some of which are still in service today along with the Anderson. She was launched on February 16, 1952, and was acquired in August of that same year. She came in at 26,523 gross registered tons, and measured 647 feet in length with a beam of 70 feet. Similar to the Fitzgerald, she was equipped with a single 7,700 shaft horsepower Westinghouse steam turbine engine, driving a single screw and achieving a top speed of 15 knots. The Anderson's Captain Bernie Cooper had made radio contact with Captain McSorley of the Fitz. The forecast for November 9th and November 10th had originally forecasted a routine storm for the Great Lakes region. The coming storm wasn't supposed to be anything concerning, as it was only supposed to bring a little bit of rain followed by a little bit of snow. However, at 5 p.m., the National Weather Service had issued a warning that stated the winds on Lake Superior had reached 45 miles per hour. Both freighters agreed to change course to stay closer to the Ontario shore to seek a little shelter in the storm. Unfortunately, after midnight, the winds had jumped to 65 miles per hour and wave heights of 15 feet. Nothing like what had been originally forecasted. But the crew in the pilot house of the Fitzgerald were confident that their freighter could bull her way through the gale, especially since she had survived similar storms in her career, and her steel plates were designed to bend and flex in rough seas without breaking. By the next day, November 10th, the storm wasn't getting any better, and it wasn't getting any worse. The Fitz was approaching the channel between the two Canadian islands, Michipicoten and Caribou. Just off the shore of Caribou Island were shallows with jagged rocks that could tear a hole in a passing vessel. Meanwhile, Captain Cooper of the Arthur Anderson, about 15 miles behind the Fitz, monitors the ship on his radar screen, and the radar showed the Fitzgerald sailing treacherously close to the Caribou Island shallows. It looks to the crew of the Anderson that the Fitzgerald sailed right over the shallows. If those two vessels thought things couldn't get any worse, it did. Both vessels were headed to the calm waters of Whitefish Bay, at the foot of Lake Superior, around 45 miles away. However, the power went out at Whitefish Bay, causing the lighthouse's light and the radio beacon to go out, which was needed to guide ships toward the bay. And to make matters worse, both the Fitzgerald's radar units had been disabled in the weather. Captain McSorley had to rely on the Anderson's radar to tell him where he was, through the radio. McSorley ordered the Fitzgerald's speed to be reduced so the Anderson could catch up with them. By now, with the lighthouse light out, the radar disabled, and sailing in 30-foot waves, driving snow, and 90-mile-per-hour winds, the Fitz was sailing blind on that afternoon of November 10th. Although the crew didn't know it, slowly the Fitzgerald was sinking. McSorley radioed Cooper that the storm had torn off some of the ship's vents, and they had taken to starboard list. The Anderson, still 9 miles behind the Fitz, was in much better conditions. Even if the crew knew their ship was in danger, options for rescue were limited. The Coast Guard didn't have any vessels near the Fitzgerald that could withstand the storm. The nearest one that could survive the storm was in Duluth, more than a day away from where they were. And the heavy seas meant that the lifeboats couldn't be launched. The crew just hoped that the ship could weather the storm and make it safely to Whitefish Bay, about 25 miles away. At 7 p.m., Cooper radioed McSorley, "We haven't got far to go. We will soon have it made." McSorley replied, Yes, we will. Just after that, a huge squall of driving snow descended over the two ships, and the first mate of the Anderson radioed the Fitzgerald on how they were doing with their problems. Captain McSorley replied, "We are holding our own." About 20 minutes later, Fitzgerald vanished from the Anderson radar screen. Other vessels were picked up on the radar, but the Fitz simply vanished from where she should have been. Cooper tried to contact the Fitzgerald on the radio, but there was no response. The Fitzgerald had simply disappeared, with no distress call or mayday. Cooper asked nearby vessels if they had heard from the Fitz. None of them did. Cooper radioed the Sault Ste. Marie Coast Guard station.
Stand by one. Let me get the Arthur Anderson on this frequency. He is the vessel that reported seeing the Fitzgerald disappear from his radar screen, and he was the last one that was in radar contact with him. The thing about it was, we come up there, we called the Fitzgerald to check on him and see how he was doing, and the last contact we had with him, he said, well, he was going along fine and holding his own and no problem.
At 8:45 p.m., the Arthur Anderson made it to Whitefish Bay, knowing that the Fitzgerald never would and never did make it. The Coast Guard dispatched aircraft from Sault Ste. Marie to search for any survivors, and asked the Anderson and other freighters to search for survivors. But Cooper was skeptical.
Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large, and God, I'm afraid that I'm going to take a hell of a beating out there on it.
I was reluctant to go, really I was. But he said there's a ship on the bottom, and I felt like saying there could be two if I go back, but I finally decided I'd go out.
The Arthur Anderson, as well as the freighter William Clay Ford, went back into the maelstrom to search for any signs of Fitzgerald's survivors, despite the fact that the chance of finding survivors was slim. As the news of Fitzgerald's disappearance made the news the following day, the families of the crew were desperate to know if they were safe. The Anderson and the Ford found no signs of the Fitzgerald or her crew. Even after those two freighters had no luck finding survivors, the Coast Guard still sent out rescue ships to do more searching, until it became clear after a few days that the Fitzgerald was lost with all hands. The only remnants of the ship ever found were an oil-coated life ring and an empty, damaged lifeboat. On November 14th, 4 days after the disappearance, a U.S. Navy aircraft located the wreck of the sunken Edmund Fitzgerald with sonar. She was found 17 miles from Whitefish Bay in 530 feet of water, broken in two. After the discovery, the Coast Guard launched an investigation to solve the mystery of Fitzgerald's loss, taking hundreds of photographs and hours of footage. However, this report would not be released until July 1977, and even then, the Coast Guard did not give a report on what caused the ship to founder. The only thing that they could do was come up with theories to explain the unexplainable. However, it was reported that the crew of the Fitzgerald did what they should have and performed well. One of the theories regarding Fitzgerald's disappearance was that the cargo hatches were not fastened correctly, and that the cargo hatches were overdue for maintenance, which they actually were. The theory is that as the waves continued to board Fitzgerald's deck, the water was seeping through the hatch closers and into the ship's hold. And this continued for some time until the Fitzgerald had no buoyancy left, and she dove into a wave and sank. But many doubt this theory, considering that Fitzgerald's first mate, Jack McCarthy, supervised the loading of her cargo, and that he wouldn't have allowed the hatches to be improperly secure. The most likely explanation was that the Fitz had grazed her hull on the shoals just off the shore of Caribou Island. This was widely accepted because Fitzgerald's Captain McSorley reported that the ship had taken a starboard list after passing Caribou Island, and the crew would have no idea that they struck a shoal and that they were taken on water because the ship is rolling constantly in the storm. She continues on until she dives into a wave. The crew thought that they would come back up, but the ship had no buoyancy left, and she hit the lake bed, and the waves on the surface tore the ship in half, and then the stern sank, landing about 170 feet from the bow section. Captain Bernie Cooper of the Anderson supported this theory because his radar showed the Fitzgerald sailing over the Caribou Island shoals.
I don't care what anybody says, at 3:10 in the afternoon she had either bottomed out or had a stress fracture of the hull. That's the only two possibilities I have. She was sinking from that time on. My opinion is she bottomed out.
Even with all the evidence, we still can't determine what caused the Fitzgerald to sink, a mystery that continues to puzzle experts to this day. Over the years, the Fitzgerald has started to grow in popularity, especially with Gordon Lightfoot's 1976 hit song Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and even with some interesting dives to the wreck site. However, the families of Fitzgerald victims did not like the continuing dives to the wreck. In 1994, Ruth Hudson, mother of Bruce Hudson, one of the ship's victims, and other family members started a campaign to declare Fitzgerald's wreck a burial site that was off limits to diving.
Everything has been found out that can be, and there's no reason for anyone to be going to the Fitzgerald anymore. And we just feel that it's their grave site, and that should be respected.
But to provide solace to the family members, one last dive to the wreck site was made to raise the Fitzgerald's bell and restore it, which took place in July of 1995. Soon the bell came up after nearly 20 years. Today it sits in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Paradise, Michigan, not far from where the Edmund Fitzgerald rests on the lakebed today. Although Fitzgerald's wreck is off limits to diving, connections to her loss do still exist today. For example, the Arthur M. Anderson is still in active service to this day, though she looks much different than she did back then. She has since been converted to a self-unloader, has had change of livery, and her hull has been lengthened. As for the William Clay Ford, she was in service until 1986, when her hull was scrapped, except for her pilot house, which now sits in Belle Isle State Park in Detroit. Maybe if the Fitzgerald didn't sink on that November night, she might have still been operating on the lakes today.